Chapter 3. But Mrs. Clyde-Brown's fears were groundless. Peregrine was perfectly happy. Unlike more sensitive boys who found the school an intimation of hell, he was in his element. This was in large measure due to his size. At 15, Peregrine was almost 6 feet tall, weighed 11 stone, and, thanks to the misguided advice of a physics teacher at his prep school, who had observed that even if he did 100 press-ups every morning, he still wouldn't understand the theory of gravity, he was also immensely strong. At Groxbourne, size and strength mattered. Founded in the latter half of the 19th century by a hopelessly optimistic clergyman to bring Anglo-Catholic fervour to the local farmers' sons, the school had remained so obscure and behind the times that its traditions were those of an earlier age. There was fagging and beating and a good deal of bullying. There were also prefects, the ritual of morning and evening chapel, cold showers, draughty dormitories, and wholesome, if inedible, food. In short, Groxbourne maintained the routine of its founder without achieving his ambitions. For Peregrine, these abstract considerations had no meaning. It was enough that he was too hefty to bully at all safely, that the school bell chimed at regular intervals throughout the day to tell him that a lesson had ended or lunch was about to begin, and that he never had to think what he was supposed to be doing. Best of all, his tendency to take things literally was appreciated. In any case, no master ever encouraged him to take his time. It was always, "Now shut up and get on with it." And Peregrine got on with it to such an extent that for the first time in his life he found himself nearer the top of the class than the bottom. But it was on the games field that his ability to take things literally paid off. In rugby he hurled himself into scrums with a lack of fear that won him a place in the junior 15 and the admiration of the coach, himself a Welshman and well qualified to judge murderous tactics. "I've never seen a youngster like him," Mr. Evans told Gladstone after a match in which Peregrine had followed instructions to the letter by putting the boot in, heeling the ball out with a fury that suggested he intended taking the opposing packs with it, and tackling a fly half so ferociously that the fellow was carried off the field with concussion, while Peregrine claimed his shorts as a trophy. It was the same with boxing. Peregrine brought a violence to the sport that terrified his opponents and alarmed the instructor. "When I said, 'Now let's see who can shove the other bloke's teeth through his tonsils,' I didn't mean belt the blighter when he's unconscious," he protested, after Peregrine, having knocked another boy stone cold, proceeded to hold him against the ropes with one hand while punching him repeatedly in the mouth with the other. Even Major Featherington was impressed. Mr. Clyde-Brown's boast that his son was a keen shot proved true. Peregrine had an unerring eye. On the small ball range his bullets so seldom missed the bull that the Major, suspecting he was missing the target with all but one, put up a large paper screen behind it and was amazed to find that he was wrong. All Peregrine's bullets hit the bull, and the assault course held no terrors for him. He scaled the brick wall with remarkable agility, dropped cheerfully into the muddy ditch, swung across the gully and squirmed through the waterlogged tunnel without a qualm. Only the death slide caused him some problems. It wasn't that he found difficulty sliding down it, clinging to a toggle rope, but that he misunderstood the Major's instruction to return to the starting point and proceeded to climb back up the wire hawser hand over hand. By the time he was halfway up and hanging 40 feet above the rocks at the bottom of the quarry, the Major was no longer looking and had closed his eyes in prayer. "Are you all right, sir?" Peregrine asked when he had reached the top. The Major opened his eyes and looked at him with a mixture of relief and fury. "Boy," he said, "this is supposed to be an assault course, not a training ground for trapeze artists and circus acrobats. Do you understand that?" "Yes, sir," said Peregrine. "Then in future you will do exactly what you are told." "Yes, sir, but you said to return to—" "I know what I said, and I don't need reminding," shouted the Major, and cancelled the rest of the afternoon's training to get his pulse back to normal. 2 days later he was to regret his outburst. He returned from a 5-mile cross-country run in the rain to discover that Peregrine was missing. "Did any of you boys see where he got to?" he asked the little group of exhausted, overactive underachievers when they assembled in the changing room. "No, sir. He was with us when we reached the bottom of Laynton Gorge. You remember, he asked you something." The Major looked out on the darkening sky. It had begun to snow, and seemed to recall Peregrine asking him if he could swim the river instead of using the bridge. Since the question had been put when the Major had just stumbled over a stone into a patch of stinging nettles, he couldn't remember his answer. He had an idea it had been abrupt. "Oh, well, if he isn't back in half an hour, we'll have to send out a search party and notify the police," he muttered, and went up to his room to console himself over a brandy with the thought that Clyde-Brown had probably drowned in the river. 12 hours later, his hopes and fears were proved to be unfounded. The police, using Alsatians, had discovered Peregrine sheltering quite cheerfully in a barn 10 miles away. "But you definitely told me to get lost, sir," he explained when he was brought back to the school at 5 in the morning. Major Featherington fought for words. "But I didn't mean you," he began. "And the other day you said I was to do exactly what you told me to," continued Peregrine. "God help us," said the Major. "Yes, sir," said Peregrine, and went off with the school sister to the sanatorium. But if his consistency was a pain in the neck to the Major, his popularity with the boys remained high. Not only was Peregrine never bullied, but he guaranteed the safety of other new boys who could always look to him to fight for them. And thanks to his size and his looks, his battered appearance as a baby had been aggravated by boxing, not even the most frustrated sixth-former found him sexually inviting. In short, Peregrine was as prodigiously a model public schoolboy as he had previously been a model child. It was this extraordinary quality that first drew the attention of Mr. Gladstone to him, and shaped his destiny. Mrs. Clyde-Brown had been quite right in her assessment of the housemaster. Mr. Gladstone was peculiar. The son of a retired rear admiral of such extreme right-wing views that he had celebrated the Blitz on London by holding a firework display on Guy Fawkes Night 1940, Gerald Gladstone had lost not only the presence of his father, but that of his own left eye, thanks to the patriotic if inept efforts of a gamekeeper who had aimed a rocket at his employer and missed. With the eye went Gladstone's hope of pursuing a naval career. Rear Admiral Gladstone went with the police to be interned on the Isle of Man, where he died 2 years later. The subsequent punitive death duties had left his son practically penniless. Mr. Gladstone had been forced to take up teaching. "A case of arrested development," had been the headmaster's verdict at the time, and it had proved true. Mr. Gladstone's only qualifications as a teacher, apart from the fact that his late father had been chairman of the Board of Governors at Groxbourne, had been his ability to read, write, and speak English with an upper-class accent. With the wartime shortage of schoolmasters, these had been enough. Besides, Gladstone was an enthusiastic cricketer and gave the school some social cachet by teaching fencing. He was also an excellent disciplinarian and had only to switch his monocle from his glass eye to his proper one to put the fear of God up the most unruly class. By the end of the war, he had become part of the school, and too remarkable a personage to lose. Above all, he got on well with the boys in a wholesome way and shared their interests. A model railway addict, he had brought his own elaborate track and installed it in the basement of the gym, where, surrounded by his chaps, he lived out in miniature his earliest ambition without the ghastly fatalities that would evidently have resulted from its fulfilment on a larger scale. It was the same with his intellectual interests. Mr. Gladstone's mental age was, as far as literature was concerned, about 14. He never tired of reading and rereading the classic adventure stories of his youth, and in his mind's eye, forever searching for a more orthodox hero than his father on whom to model himself, found one in each old favourite. He was by turns D'Artagnan, Richard Hannay, Sherlock Holmes, the Scarlet Pimpernel, who accounted for his monocle, and Bulldog Drummond, anyone in fiction who was a courageous and romantic defender of the old, the good and the true, against the new, the wicked and the false, as he and their authors judged these things. In psychological terms, it could be said that Mr. Gladstone suffered from a chronic identity problem, which he solved by literary proxy. Here again he shared his enthusiasms with the boys, and if his teaching of English literature was hardly calculated to get them through O-level, let alone A, it had at least the merit of being exciting and easily understood by even the dullest 15-year-old. Year after year, Groxbourne turned out school leavers imbued with the unshakable belief that the world's problems, and particularly the demise of the British Empire, stemmed from a conspiracy of unwashed Bolsheviks, Jews in high finance, and degenerate black men and Germans with hooded eyelids who tapped their fingers on their knees when at all agitated. In their view, and that of Mr. Gladstone, what was needed was a dedicated band of wealthy young men who were prepared to reinforce the law by going outside it, to the extent of bayoneting left-wing politicians in their own cellars, or, in more extreme cases, tossing them into baths filled with nitric acid. That they didn't put Bulldog Drummond's remedies into practice was largely due to lack of opportunity and the need to get up at dawn to do the milking and go to bed before the criminal world was fully awake. But above all, they were saved by their own lack of imagination, and later by the good sense of their wives. Mr. Gladstone was less encumbered. His imagination, growing wilder with age, could imbue the most commonplace events with arcane significance, and successive school matrons with charms they most certainly did not possess. He was only prevented from proposing to them by an exaggerated sense of his own social standing. Instead, he was sexually self-sufficient, felt guilty about his partially enacted fantasies, and did his damnedest to exercise them by taking a cold bath every morning, summer and winter. During the holidays he visited one or other of his numerous, and in some cases still wealthy, relatives, or followed, as far as changed circumstances allowed, in the footsteps of his fictional heroes. Thus, like Richard Hannay in the 39 Steps, though without the incentive of a murdered man in his rooms, he took the morning train from London to Scotland and spent several exceedingly uncomfortable nights trying to sleep in the heather before deciding he was more likely to catch pneumonia than find adventure in such a bleak and rain-sodden part of the world. The following summer he had followed Richard Chandos' route to Austria, this time on a motorcycle, in the hope of locating the great well at Wagensberg, only to discover Corinthia was packed with coachloads of tourists and German holiday-makers. Mr. Gladstone retreated to side roads and walked forest paths in a vain attempt to invest the area with its old magic. And so, each summer, he made another pilgrimage to the setting of an adventure story and came home disappointed but with a more fanatical gleam in his eye. One day he would impose the reality of his literary world on that of the existing one. In fact, by the time Peregrine came under his care, it was extremely doubtful if the housemaster had any idea what decade he was living in. The rolling stock and carriages of his model railway suggested the 1920s with their wagon-lit and Pullman cars, which were all pulled by steam engines. But his proudest and most dangerous possession, acquired from a dead uncle, was a 1927 Bentley, in which, until he was asked by the headmaster to spare the school a multiple tragedy, he terrified a few favoured boys and every other road user by hurtling at tremendous speed along narrow country lanes and through neighbouring villages. "But it was built for speed and eats the miles," Gladstone protested. "You won't find a car to equal it on the road today." "Mercifully," said the headmaster, "and it can eat as many miles as it wants out of term time, but I'm not having the school sanatorium turned into a mass morgue as a result of your insane driving." "Just as you say, headmaster," said Gladstone, and he had kept the Bentley in immaculate condition, locked away in his garage, awaiting the day when it would, as he put it, come into its own. With the arrival of Peregrine Clyde-Brown at Groxbourne, that day seemed to have come closer. Mr. Gladstone had found the perfect disciple, a boy endowed with the physique, courage, and mental attributes of a genuine hero. From the moment he had caught Peregrine in the school bogs beating Soskins Major to a pulp for forcing a fag to wipe his arse for him, Mr. Gladstone had known that his involuntary calling had not been wasted. But, with the discretion that came from having seen what had happened to several masters in the past who had shown too early an interest in particular boys, he demonstrated his own impartiality by speaking to the house prefects. "I want you chaps to keep an eye on Clyde Brown," he told them. "We can't have him getting too big for his boots. I've known too many fellows spoiled because they're good at games and so on. Popularity goes to their heads and they begin to think they're the cat's whiskers, right?" For the rest of the term, Peregrine's presumed ambition to be any part of the cat's anatomy was eradicated. When he wasn't doing 1,000 lines for not polishing a prefect's shoes properly, he was presenting his backside to the head of house, wielding a chalked cane, for talking in dormitory after lights out when he hadn't been, or for taking too long in the showers. In short, Peregrine was subjected to a baptism of punishment that would have caused a normally sensitive boy to run away or have a nervous breakdown. Peregrine did neither. He endured. It simply never crossed his mind that he was being singled out for special treatment. It was only when he was accused of a singularly beastly sin against nature by the matron who had found blood on his pyjama trousers that he was forced to explain. "Well, it's just that I got 12 strokes yesterday, and 8 the day before," he said. "A chap can't help bleeding." "You mean you've had 20 strokes since Tuesday?" said the matron, utterly appalled. "Well, you can count them if you like," said Peregrine, matter-of-factly. "Though actually, I had 16 last week, and they're still showing, so it'll be difficult to sort them out." Half an hour later, after his backside had been inspected by the matron and the doctor, Peregrine was lying face down in bed in the sand, and the headmaster had sent for Mr. Gladstone. Since he was rather more progressive than his predecessor and held strong views on corporal punishment, and had been waiting to have a row with Gladstone, the meeting was acrimonious. "Do you realise we could be sued for damages for what's been done to that poor boy?" he demanded. "I don't see how," said Gladstone, lighting his pipe nonchalantly. "Clyde Brown hasn't complained, has he?" Complained? No, he hasn't, which only goes to show how brutally you run your house. The poor boy is clearly too terrified to say anything for fear he'll get another thrashing if he does. Mr. Gladstone blew a smoke ring. Is that what he says? No, it isn't. It's what I say, and what I mean. If he doesn't say it, I don't see how you can argue that he means it, said Mr. Gladstone. Why don't you ask him? By God, I will, said the headmaster, rising to the bait, though I'm not having him intimidated by your presence. I'll speak to him alone, and you'll kindly wait here while I do. And leaving Mr. Gladstone to browse through his personal correspondence with a curiosity the housemaster would have found disgusting in one of his chaps, he marched off to the San. By the time he returned, Gladstone had put some more wood on the fire, together with 2 unopened envelopes for the hell of it, and the headmaster was forced to temporise. Peregrine had refused to complain about his treatment, and in spite of the headmaster's pleading, had said he was jolly happy in Gloddy's house, and anyway, chaps ought to be beaten. What did I tell you? Said Gladstone, and sucked noisily on his pipe. Boys appreciate a firm hand, and Clyde-Brown's made of the right stuff. Perhaps, said the headmaster morosely, but whatever stuff he's made of, I don't want any more of it beaten this term. It may interest you to know that his father is a leading solicitor and has paid his son's fees in advance. A man in his position could bring a court action that would bankrupt the school. Just as you say, headmaster, said Gladstone, and took his leave, while the headmaster went back distraughtly to his depleted correspondence and considered desperate measures for getting rid of the ghastly Gladstone. Outside the study, the housemaster knocked his pipe out into a bowl of hyacinths and returned to his rooms. There he selected one of his favourite books, Mr. Standfast by John Buchan, and took it up to the San. Thought you might like something to read, old chap, he said to the back of Peregrine's head. Thanks very much, sir, said Peregrine. And, jolly good show on your part, not letting the side down, continued Mr. Gladstone. So, when you've finished that, tell matron and I'll bring you another. The literary infection of Peregrine had begun. Chapter 4. It continued. By the time he was allowed out of the sanatorium, Peregrine had finished all the adventures of Richard Hannay and was well into Bulldog Drummond's. He went home for the holidays with several volumes from Gladstone's library, a letter from the headmaster explaining that he intended to abolish corporal punishment and apologising for Peregrine having to be beaten at all, an excellent report on his term's work, and a positively glowing testimony from Mr. Gladstone. Mr. Clyde-Brown read the headmaster's letter with mixed feelings, and didn't show it to his wife. In his opinion, there was a great deal to be said for beating Peregrine, and in any case, it seemed to suggest that the brute had at last taken it into his head not to do what he was told. Mr. Clyde-Brown took that as a good sign. His views of the excellent report and Gladstone's testimony were different. "He seems to be doing extremely well at his work," said Mrs. Clyde-Brown. "He's got an alpha for every subject." "One hesitates to think what the beaters must be like," said Mr. Clyde-Brown, who was surprised to learn that any of the masters at Groxbourne knew enough Greek to use alpha. "And Mr. Gladstone writes that he has shown remarkable character and is a credit to the house." "Yes," said Mr. Clyde-Brown. "He also says Peregrine is a born leader, and that's a downright lie if ever I heard one." "You just don't have any faith in your own son." Mr. Clyde-Brown shook his head. "I have every faith in him, except when it comes to leading. Now, if that damn fool housemaster thinks... Oh, never mind." "But I do mind. I mind very much, and I'm thankful that Peregrine has at last found someone who appreciates his true gifts." "If that's all he does appreciate," said Mr. Clyde-Brown with a rather nasty emphasis. "And what exactly does that mean?" "Nothing. Nothing at all." "It does, or you wouldn't have said it." "I just find the letter peculiar, and I seem to remember that you found Mr. Gladstone peculiar yourself." Mrs. Clyde-Brown bridled. "If you're thinking what I think you're thinking, you've got a filthier mind than even I would have supposed." "Well, it's been known to happen," said Mr. Clyde-Brown, among whose guiltier clients there had been several seedy schoolmasters. "Not to Peregrine," said Mrs. Clyde-Brown adamantly, and for once her husband had to agree. When, next day, on the pretence of having to mow the lawn in December, he questioned Peregrine on the subject, it was clear that he took a robust attitude towards sex. "Onanism? What's that?" he shouted above the roar of the lawnmower. Mr. Clyde-Brown adjusted the throttle. "Masturbation," he whispered hoarsely, having decided that autoeroticism would meet with the same blank look. "Master who?" said Peregrine. Mr. Clyde-Brown dredged his mind for a word his son would understand and decided not to try self-abuse. wanking, he said finally with a convulsive spasm. How much wanking goes on at school? Oh, wanking, Peregrine shouted as the lawnmower destroyed Mr. Clyde-Brown's cover by stopping. Well, Harrison's are a lot of wankers, and Slimes go in for a lot of brown hatting, but in Gloddy's we— Shut up! Yelled Mr. Clyde-Brown, conscious that half the neighbours in Pine Tree Lane were about to be privy to what went on in Gloddy's. I don't want to know. I can't see why you asked then, bawled Peregrine, still evidently under the impression that the lawnmower was purely incidental to the discussion. You asked if there was a lot of wanking, and I was telling you. Mr. Clyde-Brown dragged lividly at the mower's starting cord. Anyway, Gloddy's don't, if that's what you're worried about, continued Peregrine, oblivious of his father's suffering. And when Matron thought I'd been shafted, I told her— Mr. Clyde-Brown wrenched the lawnmower into life again and drowned the rest of the explanation. It was only later in the garage, and after he'd warned his son that if he raised his voice above a whisper he'd live to regret it, that Peregrine finally established his innocence. He did so in language that appalled his father. Where the hell did you learn the term brown hatter? He demanded. Oh, I don't know. Everyone uses it in Slimes. I don't use it, said Mr. Clyde-Brown, and what's slime got to do with it? No, don't tell me, I can guess. Slime's a shit, said Peregrine. Mr. Clyde-Brown turned the statement over in his mind and found it grammatically puzzling and distinctly crude. I should have thought it was bound to be, he said finally, though why you have to reverse the order of things and use the indefinite article into the bargain beats me. Peregrine looked bewildered. Well, all the other chaps think Slimey's wet and he's sucking up to the head. He wears a bow tie. Who does? Mr. Slime. Mr. Slime? Who the hell is Mr. Slime? He's the geography master, and there's always been a feud between his house and Gloddy's ever since anyone can remember. I see, said Mr. Clyde-Brown vaguely. Anyway, I don't want you to use foul language in front of your mother. I'm not paying good money to send you to a school like Groxbourne for the privilege of having you come home swearing like a trooper. But at least Mr. Clyde-Brown was satisfied that Mr. Gladstone's extraordinary enthusiasm for his son was obviously not based on sex, though what cause it had he couldn't imagine. Peregrine appeared to be as obtuse as ever and as unlikely to fulfil the Clyde-Browns' hopes, but he seemed to be happy and rudely healthy. Even his mother was impressed by his eagerness to go back to school at the end of the holidays and began to revise her earlier opinion of Groxbourne. Things must have changed with the new headmaster, she said, and by the same process, which saw no bad in her acquaintances because she knew them, she now conferred some distinction on Groxbourne because Peregrine went there. Even Mr. Clyde-Brown was relatively satisfied. As he had predicted, Peregrine stayed on in the summer holidays and allowed his parents to have an unencumbered holiday by going on Major Featherington's Fieldcraft and Survival course in Wales. And at the end of each term, Peregrine's report suggested that he was doing very well. Only in geography was he found to be wanting, and Peregrine blamed that on Mr. Slime. You've got it in for everyone in Gloddy's, he told his father. You can ask anyone. I don't need to. If you will insist on calling the wretched man slimy, you deserve what you can get. Anyway, I can't see how you can be doing so well in class and fail O-levels at the same time. Gloddy says O-levels don't matter. It's what you do afterwards. Then Mr. Gladstone's notion of reality must be sadly wanting, said Mr. Clyde-Brown. Without qualifications, you won't do anything afterwards. Oh, I don't know, said Peregrine. I'm in the first 11 and the first 15, and Gloddy says if you're good at sports, to hell with what Mr. Gladstone says, said Mr. Clyde-Brown, and dropped the subject. His feelings for Gladstone were but a faint echo of those held by Mr. Slime. He loathed Gladstone. Ever since he had first come to Groxbourne some 15 years before, Slime had loathed him. It was a natural loathing. Mr. Slime had, in his youth, been a sensitive man, and to be christened Slimy in his first week at the school by a one-eyed buffoon with a monocle who professed openly that a beaten boy was a better boy had, to put it mildly, rankled. Mr. Slime's view on punishment had been humane and sensible. Gladstone and Groxbourne had changed all that. In a desperate attempt to gain some respect and to deter his classes from calling him slimy to his face, he had devised punishments that didn't include beating. They ranged from running 10 times to the school gates and back, a total distance of some 5 miles, to learning Wordsworth's Prelude off by heart, and in extreme cases, missing games. It was this last method that brought things to a head. Groxbourne might not be noted for its academic standards, but rugby and cricket were another matter, and when boys who were fast bowlers or fullbacks complained that they couldn't play in school matches because Mr. Slime had put them on punishment, the other masters turned on him. "But I can't have my authority undermined by being called nicknames to my face," Slime complained at a staff meeting convened after he had put 6 boys in the first 11 on punishment 2 days before the Bloxham match. "And I'm damned if I'm going to field a side consisting of more than half the second 11, protested the infuriated cricket coach, Mr. Doran. "As it is, Bloxham is going to wipe the floor with us. I've lost more practice time in the nets this term than any summer since we had the mumps epidemic in 1952. And then we were in quarantine and couldn't play other schools, so it didn't matter. Why can't you beat boys like any decent master?" "I resent that," said Mr. Slime. "What has decency to do with beating?" The headmaster intervened. "What you don't seem to understand, Mr. Slime, is that it's one of the occupational facts of teaching life to be given a nickname. I happen to know that mine is Bruin, because my name is Bear." "I dare say," said Mr. Slime, "but Bruin's a pleasant name, and doesn't undermine your authority. Slimy does." "And do you think I like being called the orangutan?" demanded Mr. Doran. "Any more than Gladstone here enjoys Cyclops, or matrons flattered by being known as Miss World 1914? "No," said Mr. Slime, "I don't suppose you do. But you don't get called orangutan to your face." "Precisely," said Mr. Gladstone. "Any boy foolish enough to call me Cyclops knows he's going to get thrashed, so he doesn't." "I think beating is barbaric," maintained Mr. Slime. "It not only brutalizes the boys—" "Boys are brutal. It's in the nature of the beast," said Gladstone. "But it also brutalizes masters who do it. Gladstone's a case in point." "I really think there's no need to indulge in personal attacks," said the headmaster, but Mr. Gladstone waved his defence aside with a nasty smile. "Wrong again, Slime. I don't beat. I know my limitations, and I leave it to the prefects in my house to do it for me. An 18-year-old has an extremely strong right arm. And I suppose Matron gets boys to do her dirty work for her when she's called Miss World 1914, said Slime, fighting back. Major Featherington spoke up. She doesn't need to. I remember an incident 2 or 3 years ago involving Hoskis Minor. I think she used a soap enema, or was it washing up liquid, something like that. He was off games for a week anyway, poor devil. Which brings us back to the main point of contention, said the headmaster. The Bloxham match is the high point in our sporting calendar. It's of social importance for the school, too. A great many parents attend, and we'll be doing ourselves no good in their eyes if we allow ourselves to lose it. I'm therefore overriding your ban, Mr. Slime, and you will find some less time-consuming means of imposing your will on the boys. I don't care how you do it, but please bear in mind that Groxbourne is a games-playing school first and foremost. But surely, Headmaster, the purpose of education is to build character and moral fibre. You'll find our purpose set out in the Founder's Address. From that moment of defeat, Mr. Slime had suffered further humiliations. He had tried to get a job at other, more progressive schools, only to learn that he was regarded as totally unsuitable precisely because he had taught at Groxbourne. Forced to stay on, he had been despised by the boys and was made an object of ridicule in the common room by Mr. Gladstone, who always referred to him as our precious little conscientious objector. Mr. Slime fought back more subtly by raising the level of geography teaching above that of any other subject, and at the same time exercising his sarcasm so exclusively on boys from Gladstone's house that they failed their O-levels while other boys passed. But the main thrust of his revenge was confined to Gladstone himself, and over the years had developed into almost as demented an obsession as Gladstone's lust for adventure. Mr. Slime's was more methodical. He observed his enemy's habits closely, made notes about his movements, watched him through binoculars from his room in the tower, and kept a dossier of boys to whom Gladstone spoke most frequently. Originally, he had hoped to catch him out fondling a boy. Slime had brought a camera with a telescopic lens to record the event incontrovertibly, but Gladstone's secret sex life remained obstinately concealed. He even failed to rise to the bait of several gay magazines which Mr. Slime had ordered in his name. Gladstone had taken them straight to the headmaster, and had even threatened to call the police in if he received any more. As a result, Mr. Slime and the entire school had had to sit through an unusually long sermon on the evils of pornography, the detrimental effects on sportsmen of masturbation, referred to in the sermon as beastliness, and finally the cowardly practice of writing anonymous letters. The sermon ended on the most sinister note of all. If any of this continues, I shall be forced, however unwillingly, to refer these matters to the police and the long arm of the law. For the first time in his agnostic life, Mr. Slime prayed to God that the sex shop owner in Soho to whom he had sent his order wouldn't solicit Mr. Gladstone's custom again, and that the headmaster's threat wasn't as all-inclusive as it had sounded. It was a view evidently shared by the boys, whose sex life over the next few days became so restricted that the school laundry was forced to work overtime. But it was thanks to this episode that Mr. Slime first glimpsed Mr. Gladstone's true weakness. "The damned scoundrel who sent that stuff ought to have known I only read decent, manly books. Rider Haggard and Henty. Good old-fashioned adventure yarns with none of your filthy modern muck like a Forever Amber." Gladstone had boasted in the common room that evening. "What I say is, the damn poofters ought to have their balls cut off, what?" "Some of them appear to share your opinion, Gladstone," said the chaplain. "I was reading only the other day of an extraordinary case where a man actually went through some such operation and turned himself into a woman. One wonders—" But Slime was no longer listening. He put his coffee cup down and went out with a strange feeling that he had found the secret of Gladstone's success and his popularity with the boys. The wretched man was a boy himself, a boy and a bully. For a few extraordinary seconds, things reversed themselves in Mr. Slime's mind. The boys were all adults, and the staff were boys. Boys grown larger and louder in their opinions and the authority they wielded, but still small, horrid boys themselves, in their inmost being. It was as though they had been stunted in perpetual adolescence, which explained why they were still at school and hadn't dared the risks and dangers of the outside world. As he crossed the quad with this remarkable insight, as curious in its transposition of his previous beliefs as one of the negatives held up to the light in his darkroom, Mr. Slime felt a sudden relief. He was freed from the responsibilities of his career. He was no longer a schoolmaster, no longer an elderly 38. He was 18, no, 15, and entitled to a 15-year-old's ebullient spirits and unfeeling harshness, but with the marvellous difference that he had years of adult experience and knowledge on which to rely in his war with Gladstone. He would destroy the bully before he had finished. With something approaching gaiety, Mr. Slime climbed the steps in the tower to his room, 2 at a time, and added the findings that Gladstone only read adventure yarns to his dossier on the man. Downstairs, there came the sound of fighting in the dormitory. Mr. Slime rose from his desk, descended the stairs, and 10 minutes later had changed the whole pattern of his life by beating 3 boys without a qualm. Chapter 5. "Heard about Slimy's conversion?" Major Featherington said at breakfast the next morning. Gladstone peered over the Daily Express. "Don't tell me he's joining the church. God help his parishioners. No such luck. The fellow's finally come round to a proper way of dealing with boys. Beat 3 little blighters last night for pillow fighting in dorm." Mr. Gladstone put down his paper and glared at the Major with his gimlet eye. "You're joking, of course." "Damned if I am. Cleves, Milshot and Bidgerson saw their backsides this morning when they were changing for early PT. A nicer set of welts, too, you couldn't wish for." "Extraordinary. Didn't think the runt had it in him," said Gladstone, and turned back to his paper, only slightly puzzled. But when Mr. Slime came in 5 minutes later, Gladstone was genuinely startled. "Good God," he said loudly. "Never thought I'd live to see the day when you'd join us for breakfast, Slime." Slime helped himself to bacon and eggs and smiled almost cordially. "Thought it would make a change," he said. "One tends to get stuck in a rut. I'm thinking of taking up jogging, too." "Just don't do yourself an injury," said Gladstone unpleasantly. "We wouldn't know how to get along without your conscientious objections. But then I hear you don't have any now. Beat some boys last night, eh?" "They asked for it, and they got it," said Mr. Slime, managing to ignore the sarcasm. "Nothing like consistency," said Gladstone, and stalked out of the dining-room. That morning, his classes suffered from his short temper and were set essays to write, while Gladstone brooded. Slime's change of behaviour was disconcerting. If the damn fellow could suddenly alter his habits and start beating and take up jogging, Gladstone felt hard done by. Slime had always been a comforting standard of wetness against which Gladstone could measure his own forthright and manly behaviour. Damn it, the next thing the wretched Slime would do was get married. Gladstone, staring out of the window, felt a new wave of resentment boiling up inside him at the thought. Adventure had eluded him, so had romance, and he was growing older. "Might not be a bad thing to marry some woman after all," he muttered to himself. But apart from a distant cousin with no money who had once proposed to him on Valentine's Day, there were no women of his social background he could think of who would do. There were some divorced mothers, of course, whose presence at the beginning of term or on open day had excited him, but their visits were too brief for him to get to know them. Anyway, they were hardly his sort. Gloucester dismissed them from his thoughts, until he remembered La Comtesse de Montcalm. He had never met her, but Anthony Wanderby, her son by a previous marriage, was in his house, and while Gloucester disliked the little blighter — he was a typical American spoilt brat in the housemaster's eyes, and always malingering — he appreciated the crested envelopes and notepaper on which La Comtesse wrote to him from her chateau in France. Gloucester had endowed La Comtesse, in his too frequent mentions of her in the staff-room he stuck to the French, with all those qualities of beauty and nobility he had never encountered outside his books, but which had to exist somewhere. Certainly the chateau existed. Gloucester had looked it up in his Michelin map for Périgord, and found it apparently standing above the river La Bouze, a tributary of the Dordogne. A narrow road ran down beside the river, and the hillsides opposite were coloured green, which meant they were forested. It had often occurred to him to take the Bentley and find some excuse for dropping in, but anyway, there was no point in pining over her. There was doubtless some damn frog Monsieur le Comte in attendance. But that evening, after a restless day, he went up to his rooms early and sat sucking a pipe, studying the map again and turning over La Comtesse's brief letters to him. Then he folded them carefully away and replaced them in the cigar box he kept in his desk, before knocking out his pipe on the windowsill and turning in. "Damn slime," he muttered as he lay in the darkness. He would have damned him far more had he seen Mr. Slime move from the roof of the chapel opposite and descend the circular steps, holding his camera carefully with his left hand while feeling the wall with his right. He paused at the bottom, made sure the quad was empty, and crossed to the tower with the camera and 300mm lens concealed under his jacket. 10 minutes later, after locking himself in his bathroom and pulling the dark blind over the window, he had loaded the developing tank. For Peregrine, the strange contortions of character in Gloucester and Slime were too complex to be noticeable. He took them, as usual, quite literally at face value, and since Gloucester's face, with its neat moustache, monocle and glass eye, gave the impression of strength and authority, while Slime's didn't, he despised the latter. Besides, he enjoyed a man-to-man friendliness with Gloucester as a result of his enthusiastic reading of every book in his library, to the present where he was allowed to help to polish the Bentley on wet Sunday afternoons. There in the garage, with rain pattering on the glass cupola above them — the place had once been a coach-house with a few old bridles still hanging on the walls — he imbibed the code of the English gentleman, which was Gloucester's special mania. He had already merged Richard Hannay, Bulldog Drummond, and every other upstanding hero, including James Bond, into a single figure in his mind, and had conferred their virtues on Mr. Gloucester. In fact, his reading had gone further than Gloddy's, which stopped around 1930. James Bond was one such character. Gloucester wasn't too sure about Bond. "The thing is," he told Peregrine one afternoon when they had unstrapped the bonnet of the Bentley and were polishing the great engine, "the thing is with Bond that he's not your everyday decent chap who gets caught up in an adventure quite by chance. He's a sort of paid government employee, and anyway, his attitude to women's pretty rotten and sordid, and he's always flying about and gambling and generally living it up. Not a gentleman, what?" "No, sir," said Peregrine, and struck Bond off his list. Gloucester sat down on the running board and took out his pipe. "I mean to say, it's his job to deal with crime. The damn fellow's professional. He's told what to do, and he has official backing. Now, the real thing isn't like that. It happens accidentally. A chap is driving along, and he stops for a breather, and he sees murder done. And naturally he has to do something about it, and by Jove, he does. Takes the swine on outside the law, and if he gets caught, that's the luck of the draw. And another thing is, he's as fit as a fiddle, and he sticks to the countryside which he knows like the back of his hand, and the genuine crooks don't. That's the way it really is." In the presence of the Bentley, Peregrine's feelings were almost religious. Mr. Gloucester's clichés opened up an idyllic world where simple chaps made simple decisions and crooks were simply crooks and got what was coming to them. It corresponded exactly with his own view of life. One day he'd be lucky enough to see murder done and would do something about it. But apart from these occasional visions of the future, he was occupied with games, with the Major's OU course of shooting, doing the assault course, swimming in cold rivers and rock climbing in Wales during the summer holidays, and generally fitting himself for the army career his father had decided on for him. In schoolwork, he remained a failure. Each year he took his O-levels and failed. It was the only cloud on his simple horizon. There were others gathering. On the evening after his spell on the chapel roof, Mr. Slime locked himself in his bathroom, set up his enlarger, and printed the negatives. They showed Gladstone holding an envelope and placing it in a cigar box, but the 8x10 prints were not big enough to tell him more. Mr. Slime turned the enlarger round, put several books on the baseboard and focused on the bathroom floor. This time the negative was so enlarged that the print only included Gladstone's hand, the lower part of his face, and the envelope. As it appeared in the developing dish, Slime bent over it eagerly. There was something on the back of the envelope, he could see that now, but it was only when he had transferred the print to the fixer and turned the light on that he recognized, in spite of the grain, the blob as a crest. A crest? Slime's thoughts turned to Gladstone's background. The man was always boasting about his family, but there'd never been any mention of a family crest, and Gladstone was just the sort of fellow to have made a big thing about it. If it wasn't his own, what was he doing with crested envelopes? And why keep them in a cigar box? Anyway, he had learned something new to add to the dossier. Mr. Slime took the print and was about to wash it, when his cautious mind considered the dangers if it were found. It would be extremely awkward having to think of an excuse for photographing Gladstone from the chapel roof. Far better to destroy them now. He tore the photographs into strips of soggy paper and flushed them down the lavatory. The negatives went too. As he washed the dishes and cleared away, Mr. Slime pondered his next move. It might be possible to provoke Gladstone into some discussion on heraldry. He would have to do it tactfully. In the event, he had to do nothing more than listen. 2 days later, he was passing his house room when he heard two boys. "Tambon says it's a bloody great castle, like the sort of thing you see on telly with towers and everything," said a boy Slime recognised to be Peter. "I bet he sucked up to Wonderby to get himself invited," said Mowbray. "He's always doing that, and Wonderby's a grotty snob. Just because his mother's a countess and he gets letters with crests, he thinks he's going to marry a royal. Anyway, the countess is a real old cow, according to Tambon. He was scared stiff of her. You ask him what it was like." A group of boys clattering down the staircase forced Slime to move. He hurried along to the staff room, deep in thought. Was it pure coincidence that Gladstone kept crested envelopes in a cigar box, and that he had a boy in his house whose mother was a countess and used crested notepaper? And if it wasn't, what did it portend? Probably nothing, but it would be worth looking into. For a moment he considered bringing the subject of Wonderby up in Gladstone's presence and watching his reaction. But Slime's mind, honed by the misery of so many years of insult and dislike, had a new edge of cunning to it. He must do nothing to arouse the slightest glimmer of suspicion in Gladstone. Besides, there was a simple way of finding out if there was a connection between Gladstone and Wonderby's mother. Slime bided his time. His opportunity came at half-term. "I'm taking a group of chaps over to the Railway Museum at York," Gladstone announced one evening. "Never like to see boys left here and their parents don't pitch up to take them out." Giving the Bentley an airing, eh?" said the Major. "The head won't like it, old boy. Oh, not going to give him a chance to dislike it. Hired a char-a-bang for the trip." "A char-a-bang? Now there's a word that's gone out of fashion," said the chaplain. "I stick to the old ways, Padre," said Gladstone, rubbing his pipe against the side of his nose to give it a greasy shine. "They're still the best." Mr. Slime noted the archaism. It was another of the irritating facets of Gladstone's character that he seemed to ignore that the world had changed. But it was good to know that Gladstone would be away when the school was almost empty. Very good. And so, when the parents had been and the coach with Gladstone's steam engine enthusiasts had left, Mr. Slime slipped quietly along the corridor that connected his house with Gloddy's, carefully checking that each study was empty and that no one was about, and arrived at the door of Gladstone's rooms. For a moment he hesitated and listened. But there were none of the usual sounds of the school. He was safe, but his heart was beating palpably faster. 2 deep breaths to quieten it, and he was inside the room, and the door was shut behind him. He crossed to the desk. The cigar box had been in a drawer on the left-hand side. Slime tried the top one and found only exercise books and a broken pipe. The box was in the second. Keeping below the level of the window, he knelt and opened it. The envelopes were inside with the letters. With sudden decisiveness, Slime reached for the bottom one, took it out, examined the crest on the back, and noted the French stamp, and put it carefully into the inside pocket of his jacket. Then he shut the drawer and hurried back to his room. There he took out the letter and read it through with a growing sense of anticlimax. It was simply a short note written in a large, flowing hand, informing Mr. Gladstone that Anthony would be a week late in returning to school because his father was in Paris and would be flying back to the States on September the 10th. The letter was signed, "Yours sincerely, Deirdre de Montcalm." Mr. Slime sat staring at it, trying to think why Gladstone would want to keep a business letter so carefully in a cigar box and bring it out with the almost reverential look he had seen on his face through the telescopic lens. Perhaps he ought to look at the other letters in the box. They might reveal a more intimate relationship. He would do that when he took this letter back, but in the meantime he would photograph it. First, he measured the envelope and made a note of its exact dimensions. Then, fitting the 55mm micro lens to his Nikon, he photographed both the letter and the envelope, and finally, moving in to within a few inches, photographed the address on the notepaper and the crest on the back of the envelope. That done, he put the letter and envelope in his pocket and slipped back to Gladstone's room, all the time listening for any sound that might indicate that there was anyone about. But the school was still silent, and the musty smell Slime always associated with its emptiness during the holidays seemed to pervade the place. Inside Gladstone's room, he checked the letters in the cigar box, replaced the one at the very bottom, and was no wiser. Why on earth did Gladstone bring these letters out and handle them as if they were precious? Slime looked around the room for a clue. The photograph of Rear Admiral Gladstone on the quarterdeck of HMS Ramillies told him nothing. Nor did a watercolour of a large square Victorian house which Slime supposed to be Gladstone's family home, a pipe rack, another photograph of Gladstone at the wheel of his Bentley, the usual bric-a-brac of a bachelor schoolmaster, and shelves filled with books. An amazing number of books. Slime had had no idea Gladstone was such an omnivorous reader. He was about to cross to a bookshelf when a sound outside halted him. Someone was coming up the stairs. Slime moved. With understandable swiftness, he was through the door of Gladstone's bedroom and wedged up against the wash-basin behind it when someone entered the study. Slime held his breath and was conscious of a horrible weakness. Who the hell could be about when the school was supposed to be empty? And how in God's name was he to explain his presence hiding in the bedroom? For a moment, he supposed it might be the woman who cleaned Gladstone's room and made his bed. But the bed was made, and whoever was in the study was putting a book back on a shelf. Several minutes passed. Another book was withdrawn, there was silence, and the sound of the door opening and shutting again. Slime slumped against the wall with relief, but stayed there for 5 more minutes before venturing out. On the desk, he found a sheet of paper and a message written in neat but boyish script. "Dear Sir, I've returned rogue mail. It was just as good as you said. I've borrowed The Prisoner of Zenda. I hope you don't mind. Clyde-Brown." Slime stared at the message, and then let his eyes roam around the room. The books were all adventure stories. He ran along a shelf containing Henty and Westerman, Anthony Hope, A.E.W. Mason, all of Buchan. Everywhere he looked there were adventure stories. No wonder the beastly man had boasted that he only read decent manly stuff. Taking a book from a side table, he opened it. The castle hung in the woods on the spur of a mountainside, and all its walls could be seen, except that which rose to the north. It was enough. Slime had found the connecting link between Gladstone's treasure of mundane letters from the Comtesse de Montcalm, his Bentley, and his belligerent datedness. As evening came, and with it the sound of cars and boys' voices, Slime sat on in the darkness of his own room, letting his mind loose on a scheme that would use all Gladstone's adolescent lust for violent adventure and romance, lure him into a morass of misunderstanding and indiscretion. It was a delightful prospect. Chapter 6. For the rest of the term, Slime soaked himself in adventure stories. It was a thoroughly distasteful task, but one that had to be done if his plan was to work. He did his reading secretly, and, to maintain the illusion that his interests lay in an entirely different direction, he joined the headmaster's madrigal singers, bought records of Tippett and Benjamin Britten, and, ostensibly to hear Ashkenazi playing at the festival hall, drove down to London. "Slimy's trying to worm his way into the head's good graces by way of so-called music," was Gladstone's comment, but Slime's activities in London had nothing to do with music. Carefully avoiding more fashionable stationery shops, he found a printer in Paddington who was prepared to duplicate La Comtesse de Montcalm's notepaper and crested envelopes. "I'll have to see the original if you want it done exactly," he told Slime, who had produced photographs of the crest and printed address. "And it'll cost." "Quite," said Slime, uncomfortably supposing that the man took him for a forger or blackmailer or both. The following week, he found an excuse to be in the secretary's office when the mail came, and was able to filch Wandaby's letter from his mother. That Saturday, on the grounds that he had to visit a London dentist about his gum trouble, Slime was back at the printer's with the envelope he had carefully steamed open. He returned to Groxbourne with a lump of cotton wool stuck uncomfortably in his mouth to suggest some dental treatment. "I'm afraid you'll have to do without me. Dentist's orders," he explained thickly to the headmaster. "Not allowed to sing for the time being." "Dear me, we'll just have to do our best in your absence," said the headmaster, with the later comment to his wife that at least they couldn't do worse. Next day, Wandaby's lost letter was found, rather muddied, in the flower bed outside the secretary's office, and the postman was blamed. By the end of term, Slime had completed his preliminary preparations. He had collected the envelopes and notepaper, and had deposited most of them in a locked tin box at his mother's house in Ramsgate for the time being. He had renewed his passport and taken out traveller's cheques. While the rest of the staff dispersed for the Easter holidays, Mr. Slime took the cross-channel ferry to Boulogne and hired a car. From there, he drove to the Belgian frontier, before turning south at a small border crossing near Armentières. The place was carefully chosen. Even Slime had memories of old men croaking, "Mademoiselle d'Armentières, parlez-vous," in remembrance of their happy days of slaughter in the First World War, and the name would arouse just the right outdated emotions he required in Gladstone. So must the route. Slime stopped frequently to consult his maps and the guidebooks to find some picturesque way through this industrial grimness, but finally gave up. Anyway, it would heighten the romance of the wooded roads and valleys further south, and the slag heaps and coal mines had the advantage of lending the route a very convincing reality. If one wanted to enter France unobserved, this was the way to come. And so Slime kept to side roads, well away from autoroutes and big towns during his daytime driving, only moving into a hotel in a city at night. All the time, he made notes and made sure he was maintaining the spirit of Gladstone's reading without bringing him too closely in touch with the real world. For that reason, he avoided Rouen and crossed the Seine by a bridge further south, but indulged himself on Route 836 down the Eure before backtracking to Ivry-la-Bataille and noting an hotel there and its telephone number. After that, another diversion by way of Houdan and Faverolles to Nogent-le-Roi and Chartres. He was hesitant about Chartres, but one look at the cathedral reassured him. Yes, Chartres would inspire Gladstone. And what about Château Renaud, just off the road to Tours? It had been 4 miles outside Château Renaud that Mansell and Chandos had gassed Brevet in his own car. Slime decided against it and chose the minor road to Meung-sur-Loire as being more discreetly surreptitious. He would have to impress on Gladstone the danger of crossing rivers in big towns. Slime made a note, "Bridge bound to be watched," in his notebook, and drove on. It took him 10 days to plan the route, and, to be on the safe side, he stayed clear of the countryside around the Château Carmagnac, with one exception. On the 10th night, he drove to the little town of Boussat and posted 2 letters in separate boxes. To be precise, he posted envelopes, each with a crest on the back, and with his own address typed onto a self-adhesive label on the front. Then he turned north and retraced his route to Boulogne, checking each mark he had made on his maps against the comments in his notebook and adding more information. By the time he sailed for Folkestone, Mr. Slime was proud of his work. There were some advantages to be had from a degree in geography after all, and the 2 envelopes were waiting for him at his mother's house. With the utmost care, he prized off the self-adhesive labels and steamed open the lightly gummed flaps. Then he set to work with an ink pad to obliterate the date on the postmark while leaving Boussat clearly visible. For the next 3 days, he pored over the photograph of the Comtesse's letter to Gladstone and traced again and again her large, flowing handwriting. When he returned to Groxbourne, even the Comtesse herself would have found difficulty in saying which of the letters she had written without reading their contents. Mr. Slime's skills had come into their own. It was more than could be said for Peregrine Clyde-Brown. The discrepancy between his school report and his failure to pass any subject at O-level apart from the maths, which, because it allowed of no alternatives to right and wrong, he had managed to scrape through with a grade C, had finally convinced Mr. Clyde-Brown that sending his son to Groxbourne might have had the advantage of keeping the brute out of the house for most of the year, but that it certainly hadn't advanced the chances of getting him into the army. On the other hand, he had paid the fees for 3 years, not to mention his contribution to the Chapel Restoration Fund, and it infuriated him to think that he had wasted the money. "We're almost certain to be lumbered with the cretin at the end of the summer term," he grumbled, "and at this rate he'll never get a job." "I think you're being very hard on him. Dr. Andrews says he's probably a late developer. And how late is late? He'll be 50 before he knows that we is French for yes, and not an instruction to go to the toilet. And I'll be 90. "And in your second childhood," retorted Mrs. Clyde-Brown. "Quite," said her husband. "In which case you'll have double problems. Peregrine will be out of his first. Well, if you want to share your old age with a middle-aged adolescent, I don't. Since I'm spending my own middle age with a bad-tempered and callous—" "I am not callous. I may be bad-tempered, but I'm not callous. I'm merely trying to do the best for all right, our son. Well, there's still time. But his reports say—" But Mr. Clyde-Brown's patience had run out. "Reports? Reports? I'd as soon believe a single word of a government white paper as give any credence to those damned reports. They're designed to con parents of morons to go on shelling out good money. What I want are decent exam results." "In that case, you should have taken my advice in the first place and had Peregrine privately tutored," said Mrs. Clyde-Brown, knitting with some ferocity. Mr. Clyde-Brown wilted into a chair. "You may be right at that," he conceded, "though I can't imagine any educated man staying the course. Peregrine would have him in a mental home within a month. Still, it's worth trying. There must be some case-hardened crammer who could program him with enough information to get his O-levels. I'll look into it." As a result of this desperate determination, Peregrine had spent the Easter holidays with Dr. Klaus Hartbolt, late of the Army Education Corps. The doctor's credentials were of the highest. He had drilled the Duke of Durham's son into Cambridge against hereditary odds, and had the remarkable record of teaching 18 Guards officers to speak pidgin Russian without a lisp. "I think I can guarantee your son will pass his O-levels," he told Mr. Clyde-Brown. "Give me anyone for 3 weeks of uninterrupted training, and they will learn." Mr. Clyde-Brown had said he had hoped so, and had paid handsomely, and Dr. Hartbolt had lived up to his promise. Peregrine had spent 3 weeks at the doctor's school in Aldershot with astonishing results. The doctor's methods were based on his intimate observations of dogs and a close connection with several chief examiners. "Don't imagine I expect you to think, because I don't," he explained the first morning. "You are here to obey. I require the use of only one faculty, that of memory. You will learn off by heart the answers to the questions which will be set you in the exam. Those of you who fail to remember the answers will be put on bread and water. Those who are word perfect will get fillet steak. Is that clear?" The class nodded. "Pick up the piece of paper in front of you and turn it over." The class did as they were told. "That is the answer to the first question in the maths paper you will be set. You have 20 minutes in which to learn it off by heart." At the end of 20 minutes, Peregrine could remember the answer. Throughout the day, the process continued. Even after dinner it resumed, and it was midnight before Peregrine got to bed. He was wakened at 6 next morning and required to repeat the answers he had learnt the day before to a tape recorder. "That is known as reinforcement," said the doctor. "Today we will learn the answers to the French questions. Reinforcement will be done tomorrow before breakfast." Next day, Peregrine went hungrily into the classroom for geography and was rewarded with steak at dinner. By the end of the week, only one boy in the class was still incapable of remembering the answers to all the questions in history, geography, maths, chemistry, biology, and English literature. Dr. Hartbolt was undismayed. "Sit, sir," he ordered when the boy fell off his chair for the 3rd time owing to semi-starvation. The lad managed to get into a sitting position. "Good dog," said the doctor, producing a packet of choc drops. "Now beg." As the boy put up his hands, the doctor dropped a choc drop into his mouth. "Good. Now then, Parkinson, if you can obey that simple instruction, there's not the slightest doubt you can pass the exam." "But I can't read," whimpered Parkinson, and evidently tried to wag his tail. Dr. Hartbolt looked at him grimly. "Can't read? Stuff and nonsense, sir. Any boy whose parents can afford to pay my fees must be able to read." But I'm dyslexic, sir." The doctor stiffened. "So," he said, "in that case, we'll have to apply for you to take your O-levels orally. Take this note to my secretary." As Parkinson wobbled from the room, the doctor turned back to the class. "Is there any other boy here who can't read? I don't want any shilly-shallying. If you can't read, say so, and we'll have you attended to by the hypnotist." But no one in the class needed the attentions of the hypnotist. The second week was spent writing down verbatim the answers to the questions and in further reinforcement. Peregrine was woken every so often during the night and interrogated. "What is the answer to question 4 in the history paper?" said the doctor. Peregrine peered bleary-eyed into the ferocious moustache. "Gladstone's policy of Home Rule for Ireland was prevented from becoming law because Chamberlain, formerly the Radical Mayor of Birmingham, split the Liberal Party and—" "Good dog," said the doctor when he had finished, and rewarded him with a choc drop. But it was in the 3rd week that reinforcement became most rigorous. "A tired mind is a receptive mind," the doctor announced on Sunday evening. "From now on you will be limited to 4 hours sleep in every 24, 1 hour in every 6 being allocated for rest. Before you go to sleep you will write down the answers to 1 exam paper and, on being woken, will write them down again before going on to the next subject. In this way you will be unable to fail your O-levels, even if you want to." After 7 more days of conditioning, Peregrine returned to his parents exhausted and with his brain so stuffed with exam answers that his parents had their own sleep interrupted by an occasional bark and the sound of Peregrine automatically reciting the doctor's orders. They were further disturbed by Dr. Harbolt's insistence that Peregrine be prevented from returning to Groxbourne until after he had sat his exams. "It is absolutely essential that he isn't exposed to the confusion of other methods of teaching," he said. "Nothing is more damaging to an animal's learning ability than contradictory stimuli." "But Peregrine isn't an animal," protested Mrs. Clyde-Brown. "He's a delicate, sensitive—" "Animal," said her husband, whose views on his son coincided entirely with the doctor's. "Exactly," said Dr. Hardbolt. "Now, where most teachers go wrong is in failing to apply the methods used in animal training to their pupils. If a seal can be taught to balance a ball on its nose, a boy can be taught to pass exams." "But the questions are surely different every year," said Mr. Clyde-Brown. Dr. Hardbolt shook his head. "They can't be. If they were, no one could possibly teach the answers. Those are the rules of the game." "Well, I hope you're right," said Mrs. Clyde-Brown. "Madam, I am," said the doctor. "Time will prove it." And time, as far as Peregrine was concerned, did. He returned to Groxbourne a month late and, with the air of a sleepwalker, took his O-level exams with every sign that this time he would succeed. Even the headmaster, glancing through the papers before sending them off to the external examiners, was impressed. "If I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I wouldn't have believed it possible," he muttered, and immediately wrote to the Clyde-Browns to assure them that they could go ahead with their plans to enter Peregrine for the army. Mr. Clyde-Brown read the letter with delight. "He's done it! By golly, he's done it!" he whooped. "Of course he has," said Mrs. Clyde-Brown. "I always knew he was gifted." Mr. Clyde-Brown stopped whooping. "Not him," he began, and decided to say no more. Chapter 7. But Peregrine's future was being decided by more subtle influences than those of the military doctor. Mr. Gladstone had spent the holidays in search, as he put it, of some damn woman to marry. "The thing is, one doesn't want to marry beneath one," he confided to Major Featherington over several nightcaps of whisky in his rooms. "Absolutely," said the Major, whose wife had died of boredom 10 years before. "Still, if there's lead in your pencil, you've got to make your mark somewhere." Gladstone glanced at him dubiously. The Major's metaphor was too coarse for his romantic imagination. "Perhaps, but love's got to be there too. I mean, only a cad would marry a girl he didn't love, don't you think?" "Suppose so," said the Major, enjoying the whisky too much to argue from his own experience. "Still, a fellow's got to think of the future. Knew a chap once, must have been 80 if he was a day, a keen tennis player in his time, married a woman he happened to be sitting next to in the centre court at Wimbledon. Splendid match. Died in her arms a fortnight later, desperately in love. Never can tell till you try." Gladstone considered the moral of this example and found it hardly illuminating. "That sort of thing doesn't happen to me," he said, and put the cap back on the whisky bottle. "The trouble with you," said the Major, "is that you've got champagne tastes and a beer income. My advice is to lower your sights. Still, you never know. Chance has a funny way of arranging things." For once, Mr. Slime would have shared Gladstone's unspoken disagreement. He was leaving as little as possible to chance. Having discovered Gladstone's wildly romantic streak, he was determined to exploit it. But there were still problems to cope with. The first concerned Sports Day. La Comtesse de Montcalm might put in an appearance, and if the wretched woman turned out to be as formidable as the conversation he had overheard in the house-room suggested, all his preparations would be wasted. Gladstone would hardly go to the aid of a woman who was manifestly capable of looking after herself. No, it was vital that the image in Gladstone's imagination should be that of a poor, defenceless, or to be exact, a rich, defenceless, sylph-like creature with an innocence beyond belief. Slime had a shrewd idea that La Comtesse was more robust. Any mother who could send her son to Groxbourne had to be. Slime checked his dossier and found that Tambon had said, "The Countess is a real old cow," and was reassured. He also surreptitiously took a look at the visiting parents' book in the bursar's office and found no evidence that La Comtesse had ever visited the school. But, to be on the safe side, he used a geography lesson to ask all those boys whose mothers were coming to sports day to put up their hands. Wonderby didn't. Having dealt with that problem, Slime concentrated on the next one: how to phrase his letter to Gladstone. In the end, he decided on the direct approach. It would appeal to Gladstone's gallantry more effectively than anything too subtle. On the other hand, there had to be more definite instructions as well. Slime penned the letter, tracing La Comtesse's handwriting again and again for practice, and then, on a weekend visit to London, spent the night in a hotel room making a number of direct-dialed calls to France. By the time he returned to Groxbourne, he was ready to provide the instructions. Only one uncertainty remained. Gladstone might have made arrangements for his summer holidays already, in which case the timing of the letter would be vital, and Wonderby's own movements in the holidays might prove awkward too. Again, Slime made use of a geography lesson to find out where the boy was spending the summer. "I'm going to Washington to stay with my father and his girlfriend," Wonderby announced brashly. Mr. Slime was delighted, and used the statement in the common room that evening to good advantage. "I must say we have some pretty peculiar parents," he said loudly. "I was discussing time zones with 2B this morning, and that American boy, Wonderbury, suddenly said his father's got a mistress in Washington." Gladstone stopped sucking his pipe. "Can't you even remember the names of the boys you teach?" he asked angrily. "It's Wonderby. And what's all this about his father having a mistress?" Slime appeared to notice Gladstone for the first time. In your house, isn't he? Typical product of a broken home. Anyway, I'm merely repeating what he said." "Do you make a habit of poking your nose into the boys' family affairs in your lessons?" "Certainly not. As I said, I was discussing time zones and jet lag and Wonderby—" "Wonderby, for God's sake," snapped Gladstone. "Volunteered the information that he was going to Washington at the end of term and that his father—" "All right. We heard you the first time," said Gladstone, and finished his coffee hurriedly and left the room. Later that evening, as he crossed the quad, Slime was pleased to notice Gladstone sitting at his desk by the window with a cigar box beside him. The crack about the broken home and Wonderby's father having a mistress would enhance Gladstone's romantic image of La Comtesse. That night, Slime completed the task of writing out her instructions and locked the letter away in his filing cabinet. It was to remain there for another 5 weeks. The summer term dragged on. Sports day came and went, cricket matches were won or lost, and Gladstone's melancholy grew darker with the fine weather and the liveliness of youth around him. He took to polishing the Bentley more frequently, and it was there in the old coach-house one evening that he asked Peregrine what he was going to do when he left. "Father's got me down for the army, but now I've got O-levels, he's talking about my going into a bank in the city." "Not your sort of life, I'd have thought. Dash dull." "Well, it's on account of my maths," said Peregrine. "That and Mother. She's all against my going into the army. Anyway, I've got a month free first because I'm going on the Major's course in Wales. It's jolly good fun doing those night marches and sleeping out in the open." Gladstone sighed at the remembrance of his youth and came to a sudden decision. "Damn the head," he muttered. "Let's take the old girl out for a spin. After all, it's your last term, and you've done more than your fair whack in keeping her shipshape in Bristol fashion. You go off down to the school gates, and I'll pick you up there in 10 minutes. And so, for an hour, they bowled along country lanes with the wind in their faces and the great exhaust murmuring gently behind them. "You drive jolly well," said Peregrine as they swung round a corner and headed through an overhang of oaks, "and she goes like a dream." Beside him, Gladstone smiled. "This is the life, eh? Can't beat a vintage Bentley. She's a war horse just raring to go." They came to a village, and on the same impulse that had carried him so far, Gladstone stopped outside a pub. "2 pints of your best bitter, landlord," said Gladstone loudly, provoking the man into inquiring if Peregrine were 18. "No," said Peregrine, but his answer was drowned by the boom of Gladstone's voice. "Course he is! Damnation, man, you don't imagine I'd bring an underage drinker into your place?" "I've known it happen," said the barman, "so I'll make it 1 bitter and the lemonade shandy, and you can take your glasses outside to a table." "We can do better than that and take our custom elsewhere," said Gladstone, and stalked out of the pub. "That's the trouble with the damn world today. People don't know their place anymore." In my father's day, that fellow would have lost his licence and no mistake. Anyway, with a manner like that, the beer was probably flat. They drove on to the next village and stopped again. This time Gladstone lowered his voice, and they were served. As they sat on a bench outside, admiring their reflections in the shining waxed coachwork of the great car and basking in the comments it caused, Gladstone cheered up. "You can say what you like, but there's nothing to touch a pint of the best British bitter," he said. "Yes," said Peregrine, who had hardly touched his beer and didn't much like it anyway. "That's something you won't find in any other country. The Hun swills lager by the gallon, and the Dutch have their own brew, which isn't bad, but it's got no body to it. Same with the Belgians, but it's all bottled beer. Mind you, it's better than that frog muck. Charge the earth for the stuff too, but that's the French all over. Dashed odd, when you come to think of it, that the wine-drinking countries have never been a match for the beer ones when it comes to a good scrap. Probably something in the saying they've got no guts and no stomach for a fight." Peregrine drank some more beer to mark his allegiance, while Gladstone spouted his prejudices, and the world shrank until there was only one decent place to be, and that was sitting in the summer twilight in an English village, drinking English beer and gazing at one's reflection in the coachwork of an English car that had been made in 1927. But as they drove back to the school, Gladstone's melancholy returned. "I'm going to miss you," he said. "You're my sort of chap. Dependable. So if there's anything I can ever do for you, you've only got to ask." "That's jolly good of you, sir," said Peregrine. "And another thing, we can forget the sir bit from now on. I mean, it's the end of term and all that. All the same, I think you'd better hop out when we come to the school gates. No need to give the head any reason to complain, eh?" So Peregrine walked back up the avenue of beeches to the school, while Gladstone parked the Bentley and morosely considered his future. "You and I are out of place here, old girl," he murmured, patting the Bentley's headlight affectionately. "We were born in a different world." He went up to his room and poured himself a whiskey and sat in the darkening twilight, wondering what the devil he was going to do with himself during the holidays. If only he'd been younger, he'd been inclined to join Major Featherington's walkabout in Wales, but no, he'd looked damn silly now, and anyway, the Major didn't like anyone poaching on his own private ground. It was a fairly desperate Gladstone who finally took himself off to bed and spent half an hour reading the 39 Steps again. "By the hell can't something challenging come my way for once," he thought, as he switched out the light. A week later, it did. As the last coach left for the station and the cars departed, Slime struck. The school secretary's office was conveniently empty when he tucked the envelope addressed to G.P. Gladstone, Esquire, into the pigeonhole already jammed with Gladstone's uncollected mail. Slime's timing was nicely calculated. Gladstone was notorious for not bothering with letters until the pigeonhole was full. "Load of bump," he had once declared. "Anyone would think I was a pen pusher and not a schoolmaster." But with the end of term he would be forced to deal with his correspondence. Even so, he would leave it until the last moment. It was in fact 3 days before Gladstone took the bundle of letters up to his room and shuffled through them, and came to the envelope with the familiar crest, an eagle evidently tearing the entrails from a sheep. For a moment Gladstone gazed almost rapturously at the crest before splitting the envelope open with a paper knife. Again he hesitated. Letters from parents were too often lists of complaints about the treatment of their sons. Gladstone held his breath as he took it out and laid it flat on the desk. But his fears were unfounded. "Dear Mr. Gladstone," he read, "I trust you will forgive me writing to you, but I have no one else to turn to, and although we have never met, Anthony has expressed such admiration for you, indeed maintains you are the only gentleman among the masters at Groxbourne, that I feel you alone can be trusted." Gladstone reread the sentence. He had never suspected the wretched Wonderby of such perception, and then continued in a ferment of excitement. "I dare express nothing in a letter, for fear that it will be intercepted, except that I am in the greatest danger, and urgently need help in a situation which is as hazardous as it is honourable. Beyond that I cannot go in writing. Should you feel able to give me that assistance I so desperately require, go to the left luggage office at Victoria Station and exchange the enclosed ticket. I can say no more, but know you will understand the necessity for this precaution." The letter was signed, "Yours in desperation, Deirdre de Montcalm. P.S. Burn both the letter and the envelope at once." Gladstone sat transfixed. The call he had been awaiting for over 30 years had finally come. He read the letter several times, and then, taking the left luggage ticket which he put into his wallet, he ceremoniously burnt the letter in its envelope, and, as an extra precaution, flushed the ashes down the lavatory. Seconds later, He was packing, and within the half-hour the Bentley rolled from the coach-house with a rejuvenated Gladstone behind the wheel. From the window of his rooms in the tower, Slime watched him leave with a different excitement. The loathsome Gladstone had taken the bait. Then Slime, too, carried his bags down to his car and left Groxbourne, though less hurriedly. He would always be one step ahead of his enemy. Chapter 8. It was late afternoon by the time Gladstone parked the Bentley in a street near Victoria Station. He had driven down in a state of euphoria, interspersed with occasional flashes of insight, which told him the whole affair was too good to be true. There must be some mistake. Certainly his judgment of Wonderby had been wholly wrong. What had that letter said? Maintains that you are the only gentleman among the masters. Which was true enough, but he'd hardly expected Wonderby to have recognized it. Still, the boy's mother was La Comtesse, and he evidently knew a gentleman when he saw one. But for the most part, Gladstone had spent the drive concentrating on ways of reaching the Chateau Carmagnac as speedily as possible. It would depend on what message he found at the left luggage office, but if he took the Weymouth to Cherbourg ferry, he could drive through the night and be there in 24 hours. He had his passport with him and had stopped at his bank in Bridgnorth to withdraw £2,000 from his deposit account and change them into traveller's cheques. It was the sum total of his savings, but he still had his small inheritance to fall back on. Not that money counted in his calculations. He was about to embark on the expedition of his dreams. He was also going alone. It was at this point that a feeling of slight disappointment crept over him. In his fantasies, he had always seen himself accompanied by one or two devoted friends, a small band of companions whose motto would be that of the Three Musketeers, all for one and one for all. Of course, when he was young it had been different, but at 50, Gladstone felt the need for company. If only he could have taken young Clyde-Brown with him, but there was no time for that now. He must act with speed. But the message he found waiting for him at the left luggage office changed his opinion. He had been rather surprised to find that it was in fact a piece of luggage, a small brown suitcase. "Are you sure this is the article?" he asked the attendant, rather incautiously. "Listen, mate, it's yours, isn't it? You give me the ticket for it, and that's the luggage," said the man, and turned away to deal with another customer. Gladstone glanced at a label tied to the handle and was satisfied. Neatly typed on it was his own name. He walked back to the car with a new sense of caution, and twice stopped at a corner to make sure he was not being followed. Then, with the case on the seat beside him, he drove to the flat of an aged aunt in Highgate, which he was forced to use when he was in London. In keeping with his background, Gladstone would have much preferred his club, the ancient automobile, but it didn't run to rooms. "Well, I never... If it isn't Gerald," said the old lady, rather gratuitously in Gladstone's opinion, "and you didn't even write to say you were coming." "I didn't have time. Urgent business," said Gladstone. "It's a good thing that your room is still ready, just as you left it, though I'll have to put a hot water bottle in to air the sheets. Now just you sit down and I'll make a nice pot of tea." But Gladstone was in no mood for these domestic details. They clashed too prosaically with his excitement. All the same, his aunt disappeared into the kitchen while he went up to his room and opened his suitcase. Inside, it was stuffed with French newspapers, and it was only when he had taken them all out that he found the second envelope. He ripped it open and took out several sheets of notepaper. They were all crested, and the handwriting was unmistakably that of La Comtesse. "Dear Mr. Gladstone, thank you for coming thus far," he read. "It was to be expected of you, but, though I would have you come to my aid, I fear extremely you do not appreciate the dangers you will face, and I would not put you at your peril without fair warning. Desperate as my situation is, I cannot allow you to come unprepared. Those about me are wise in the ways of crime, whereas you are not. This is perhaps to your advantage, but for your own sake and for mine, be on your guard, and come, if you can, armed, for this is a matter of life and death, and murder has already been done." "Your tea's ready, dear," the old lady called from her cluttered sitting-room. "All right, I'll be there in a moment," said Gladstone irritably. Here he was, about to engage in a matter of life and death, and with murder already done, and aged aunts who called him dear and served tea were distinctly out of place. He read on. "I enclose the route you must follow. The ports are watched, and on no account must you appear to be other than an English gentleman touring through France. It is vital, therefore, that you take your time and trust no one. The men against whom you are set have agents amongst the gendarmerie and are themselves above suspicion. I cannot state their influence too highly, nor dare I catalogue their crimes in writing." This time the letter was signed, "Yours in gratitude, Deirdre de Montcalm," and as before, the postscript ordered him to burn both letter and envelope. Gladstone turned to the other page. It was typewritten and stated that he was to cross from Dover to Ostend on the early morning ferry of the 28th of July and drive to Ypres before passing the frontier into France the following day. Thereafter, his route was listed with hotels at which rooms have been booked for you. Gladstone read down the list in amazement. Considering the terrible dangers La Comtesse was evidently facing, her instructions were quite extraordinarily explicit. Only when he turned the page was there an explanation. In her own handwriting she had written, "Should I have need to communicate with you, my messages will be waiting for you in your rooms each night. And now that I have written this by hand, please copy and then burn." Gladstone reached in the pocket for a pen, only to be interrupted by his aunt. "Your tea's getting cold, dear." "Damn," said Gladstone, but went through to the sitting-room and spent an extremely impatient half an hour listening to the latest family gossip. By the time Aunt Lucy got on to the various diseases her grandnieces and nephews had been suffering from, Gladstone was practically rabid. "Excuse me, but I have some really pressing business to attend to," he said, as she launched into a particularly clinical account of the symptoms his cousin Michael had contracted, or more precisely expanded, as a result of mumps. "Balls," continued Aunt Lucy implacably. "I beg your pardon," said Gladstone, whose attention had been fixed on La Comtesse's instructions. "I was saying that I simply must go," said Gladstone, and rather rudely left the room. "What a very peculiar boy Gerald is," muttered the old lady as she cleared away the tea things. Her opinion was confirmed some 40 minutes later when she discovered the hallway was filling with smoke. "What in heaven's name are you doing in there?" she demanded of the door to the lavatory, which seemed to be the source of the fire. "Nothing," choked Gladstone, wishing to God he hadn't been so conscientious in following La Comtesse's instructions to burn all evidence. The letter and his itinerary had gone easily enough, but his attempt to screw the envelope into a ball and catch the flood had failed dismally. The envelope remained obstinately buoyant, with the crest plainly visible, and the cistern had been no great help either. Built for a more leisurely age, it filled slowly and emptied no faster. Finally, Gladstone had resorted to the French newspapers. They were incriminating too, and by crumpling them up around the sodden envelope, he might get that to burn as well. In the event, he was proved right, but at a considerable cost. The newspapers were as fiery as their editorials. As flames shot out of the pan, Gladstone slammed the lid down and was presently tugging at the chain to extinguish what amounted to an indoor bonfire. It was at this point that his aunt intervened. "Yes, you are," she shouted through the door. "You've been smoking in there, and something's caught fire." "Yes," gasped Gladstone, finding this a relatively plausible explanation. Nobody could say that he hadn't been smoking. The damn stuff was issuing round the edges of the lid quite alarmingly. He seized the towel from behind the door and tried to choke the smoke off before he suffocated. "If you don't come out this minute, I shall be forced to call the fire brigade," his aunt threatened, but Gladstone had had enough. Unlocking the door, he shot, gasping for air, into the hall. His aunt surveyed the smoke still fuming from beneath the seat. "What on earth have you been up to?" she said, and promptly extinguished the smouldering remnants of Le Monde with the basin of water from the kitchen, before examining the fragments with a critical eye. "You've been a bachelor too long," she declared finally. "Your Uncle Martin was found dead in the lavatory with a copy of La Vie Parisienne, and you've obviously taken after him. What you need is a sensible wife to take care of your baser needs." Gladstone said nothing. If his aunt chose to draw such crude conclusions, it was far better that she do so than suspect the true nature of his enterprise. All the same, the incident had taken a measure of the immediate glamour out of the situation. "I shall be dining out," he said with some hauteur, and spent the evening at his club, planning his next move. It was complicated by the date of his cross-channel booking, which was set for the 28th. He had 5 days to wait. And then there was the question of obtaining arms. The letter had definitely said, "Come armed," but that was easier said than done. True, he had a shotgun at a cousin's farm in Devon, but shotguns didn't come into the category of proper arms. He needed a revolver, something easy to conceal in the Bentley, and he could hardly go into a gunsmith in London and ask for a .38 Smith & Wesson with 100 cartridges. The thing to do would be to approach some member of the underworld. There must be plenty of people selling guns in London. Gladstone didn't know any, and had not the foggiest notion where to look for them. It was all very disconcerting, and he was about to give up the notion of going armed when he remembered that Major Featherington kept revolvers and ammunition in the school armoury. In fact, there were several old ones there, and he knew where the Major kept the keys. It would be a simple matter to take one, and he could have it back before the beginning of next term. With a more cheerful air, Gladstone ordered a brandy before returning to his aunt's flat. Next morning he was on the road again, and by lunchtime back at Groxbourne. "Fancy you coming back so soon," said the school secretary. "The galloping Major's back too, only he isn't galloping quite so much. Been and gone and sprained his ankle. Damnation, said Gladstone, horrified at this blow to his plan. I mean, poor fellow, where is he? Up in his rooms. Gladstone climbed the staircase to the Major's rooms and knocked. "Come in, whoever you are," shouted the Major. He was sitting in an armchair with one leg propped up on a stool. "Ah, Gloddy, old boy. Good to see you. Thought you had shoved off." "I had to come back for something. What on earth happened? Did you slip on some scree in Wales?" "Never got to bloody Wales. Glissaded on a dog turd in Shrewsbury and came a right perler, I can tell you. All I could do to drive that damn minibus back here. Had to cancel the OU course, and now I've got old Perry on my hands." "Peregrine Clyde-Brown?" asked Gladstone with rising hope. "Parents off in Italy somewhere. Won't be back for 3 weeks, and he's been trying to phone some uncle, but the chap's never in. Blowed if I know what to do with the lad." "How long is that ankle of yours going to take to mend?" asked Gladstone, suddenly considering the possibility that he might have found just the two people he would most like to have with him in a tight spot. "Quack's fixed me up for an X-ray tomorrow. Seems to think I might have fractured my coccyx." "Your coccyx? I thought you said you'd sprained your ankle." "Listen, old man," said the Major conspiratorially, "that's for public consumption. Can't have people going round saying I bought it where the monkey hid the nuts. Wouldn't inspire confidence, would it? I mean, would you trust a son of yours to go on a survival course with a man who couldn't spot a dog pat when he was staring him in the face? Well, as a matter of fact, I don't—" began Gladstone, only to be interrupted by the Major, who was shifting his posterior on what appeared to be a semi-inflated plastic lifebelt. "Another thing the head don't know, so for Lord's sake don't mention a word. The blighter's only too anxious to find an excuse for closing the OU course down. Can't afford to lose my job." "You can rely on me," said Gladstone. "Is there anything I can get you?" The Major nodded. "A couple of bottles of whiskey. Can't ask Matron to get it for me. Bad enough having her help me to the loo, and then she hangs about outside asking if I need any help. I'll tell you, old boy, everything they say about passing razor blades is spot on." "I'll see to the whiskey," said Gladstone, not wishing to pursue this line of conversation any further. It was obvious that the Major was a broken reed as far as the great adventure was concerned. He went downstairs in search of Peregrine. He had no difficulty. The sound of shots coming from the small arms range indicated where Peregrine was. Gladstone found him using a 2-2 to puncture the centre of a target. For a moment he watched with delight and then stepped forward. "Gosh, sir, it's good to see you," said Peregrine enthusiastically and scrambled to his feet. "I thought you'd left." Gladstone switched his monocle to his good eye. "Something's turned up. The big show," he said. Peregrine looked puzzled. "The big show, sir?" Gladstone looked cautiously round the range before replying. "A call to action," he said solemnly. "I can't give any details except to say that it's a matter of life and death." "Gosh, sir, you mean—" "Let's just say I've been asked to help. Now, as I understand it, your folks are in Italy, and you've nothing on." For a moment, Peregrine's literal mind struggled with the statement before he caught its meaning. "No, sir. I've been trying to phone my uncle, but I can't get through." "In which case, you won't be missed. That's number one. Number two is we've 3 weeks in which to do the job. I take it you've got a passport?" Peregrine shook his head. Gladstone polished his monocle thoughtfully. "In that case, we'll have to think of something." "You mean we're going abroad?" "To France," said Gladstone. "That is, if you're game. Before you answer, you must know that we'll be acting outside the law with no holds barred. I mean, it won't be any picnic." But Peregrine was already enthralled. "Of course I'm game, sir. You can count me in." "Good man," said Gladstone and clapped him on the shoulder. "Now, as to a passport, I've an idea. Didn't Mr. Massey take the 5th form French to Boulogne last year?" "Yes, sir." "And Barnes had flu and couldn't go. If I'm not wrong, the bursar said he'd kept his temporary visitor's passport back. It could be he still has it in his office." "But I don't look a bit like Barnes." Gladstone smiled. "You will by the time you cross," he said. "We'll see to that. And now for weapons. You don't by any chance have the key to the armoury, do you?" "Well, yes, sir. The Major said I could keep my eye in so long as I didn't blow my head off." "In that case, we'll pay the gunroom a visit. We need to go armed, and 2 revolvers won't be missed." "They will, sir," said Peregrine. "The Major always checks the guns." "I can't see him doing it in his present condition," said Gladstone. "Still, I don't like going unprepared." For once, Peregrine had the answer. "There's a smashing shop for replica guns in Birmingham, sir. I mean, if we—" "Splendid," said Gladstone. "The Major wants some whiskey. We can kill 2 birds with 1 stone." That evening the substitutions were made, and 2 .38 Webleys with several hundred rounds of ammunition were stored in cardboard boxes beneath the seats of the Bentley. And the problem of the passport had been solved too. Gladstone had found Barnes's in the bursar's office. "Now it remains to convince the Major that you're going to your uncle's. Tell him you're catching the 10 o'clock train, and I'll pick you up at the bus stop in the village. We don't want to be seen leaving the school together, so hop along to his room and then turn in. We've got a long day ahead of us tomorrow." Gladstone went up to his rooms and sat on in the evening sunlight, studying his route on the map and sipping pink gins. It was 9 before he remembered the Major's scotch and took him the 2 bottles. "Bless you, old lad," said the Major. "You'll find a couple of glasses in the cupboard. Save my life. And Perry's off to his uncle's tomorrow." "Really?" said Gladstone. "Anyway, you're very good health." "Going to need it by the feel of things. Bloody nuisance being cooped up here with no one much to chat to. Are you staying around for long?" Gladstone hesitated. He was fond of the Major, and the whisky coming on top of his pink gins had added to the intoxication he felt at the prospect of his adventure. "Strictly between these 4 walls," he said, "and I do mean strictly. The most extraordinary thing has happened." He hesitated. The Countess had asked for the utmost secrecy, but there was no harm in telling the Major, and if anything went wrong, it would help to have someone know. "I've had a summons from la Comtesse de Montcalm, Wanderby's mater. Apparently she's in terrible trouble and needs me—" "Must be," said the Major unsympathetically, but Gladstone was too drunk to get the message. By the time he'd finished, Major Featherington had downed several stiff whiskies in quick succession and was looking at him peculiarly. "Listen, Gloddy, you can't be serious. You must have dreamt this up." "I most certainly haven't," said Gladstone. "It's what I've been waiting for all my life, and now it's come. I always knew it would. It's destiny." "Oh, well, it's your pigeon. What do you want me to do?" "Nothing. I know how you're placed and all that, but do remember, you're sworn to secrecy. No one, but no one, must know. I want your hand on that." "If you say so," said the Major. "Shake a paw. No names, no pact drill and all that. You can rely on me. All the same. Pass the bottle. So you're crossing to Ostend?" "Yes," said Gladstone, and got up unsteadily. "Better get some shut-eye." He wove to the door and went downstairs. On the way, he met the matron and ignored her. She held no attractions for him now. La Comtesse de Montcalm wanted him, and the great romance of his life had begun. He crossed the quad. A light was burning in Peregrine's dormitory, but Gladstone didn't see it. "Fuck me," said the Major, unfortunately just as the matron entered. Peregrine shut the book and turned out the light. He had just finished The Day of the Jackal.